Hello and welcome to the last Antinatalism this week of 2025. The moral nature of gestation and the political significance of birth is a talk scheduled at the University of Toronto, Canada on 7th January as a part of their Ethics at Noonish series at 12:30 p.m. local time. It will be by Laura Ferraciolo, who is an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Sydney in Australia. Laura is also the author of Parenting and the Goods of Childhood, published in 2023. This particular talk is about questions which are peripherally relevant to antinatalism. Questions like whether birth is as morally or politically relevant as it is biologically relevant. What exactly is the status of fetuses before birth? Are they moral persons with rights, or are they citizens, or are they merely morally considerable, that is, appropriate subjects for moral concerns? I'm not sure if this talk will be recorded, but if you happen to be in the area, you may want to check this out in person. There was an interesting paper on populist pronatalist policies employed by Giorgia Meloni and Viktor Orban for political ends. Populist rhetoric and the return of gender essentialism in Europe. A critical discourse analysis of speeches by Giorgia Meloni and Viktor Orban. It is more of a sociological and political analysis rather than a philosophical one, and it talks more about how gender roles are exploited in political rhetoric, but it very nicely shows how populist leaders in Italy and Hungary are using pro-natalist propaganda. It is strange to put a blanket ban on immigration while also encouraging native people to have more children. Immigration on its own, whether you're for or against it, is a political issue and solely of a particular nation. But when it is combined with pro-natalist policies, then it raises some questions which are relevant to antinatalism. Benatar, for example, in Better Never to Have Been, says it is curious how democracy favors breeding over immigration. Offspring have a presumed right to citizenship, while potential immigrants do not. And so he asks, should somebody's freedom to create a person be more inviolable than somebody else's freedom to have a friend or a family member immigrate? These quotes from Benatar are not referenced in the paper, but I presented them here just to show the themes which Viktor Orban has been employing in Hungary. The paper nicely shows this table depicting these themes, sub-themes, and codes used for these. As you can see, national rhetoric, hyper-masculinity, militarization of threats, and perpetuating stereotypes are broad themes used by Orban. Giorgia Meloni of Italy, on the other hand, has a challenge. She is a woman and she can't generate hyper-masculine image on her own. So she uses motherhood instead. Her identity as a mother is used as a tool to connect with her constituents. As you can see here in her thematic approach, motherhood tops the chart. Motherhood is a socially recognized value. I am a mother, children make women stronger, and so on. The paper also presents an interesting observation of pro-natalist policies which give money or tax breaks to women to have more children. Extending tax exemptions for only those women who commit to having children reinforces a variety of essentialist gender stereotypes. The first one is attaching motherhood to a woman as her primary role. It somehow suggests that a woman's value or worth is tied to being a mother. This also reinforces the essentialist stereotype that women are caregivers because the proposal for tax exemption does not extend based on the shared responsibility of both partners for caretaking or social support for childcare. Lastly, it perpetuates the stereotypes that younger women are more worthy of support and care because of their increased fertility compared to older women. What's more interesting is that this paper about right-wing gender-based power hierarchies in Italy and Hungary was written by two Pakistani authors, Aruba Sarfaraz Luck and Hadia Salim. Speaking of Italy, there was an article in Italian version of Huffington Post which translated to Antinatalism Those who think there are no moral basis for having children. It goes through some of early antinatalists like Giacomo Leopardi and Arthur Schopenhauer before coming to David Benatar, which is the main focus of this article. For someone who does not know Benatar's work, this is likely a nice starting point, summarizing his main works, which are Better Never to Have Been, The Human Predicament, and The Second Sexism. Huffington Post is a well-known international media site, so an article on antinatalism by such a big brand and doing justice to the subject is always helpful. An interesting study was published in Malaysian Journal for Islamic Studies, Voluntary Childlessness and Islamic Perspectives, a systematic literature review. This was a review of 45 scholarly articles that address voluntary childlessness or topics around it in Islamic contexts. The main question was, how does Islam engage with the growing phenomenon of Muslims choosing not to have children? 5 themes of engagement were extracted from those 45 studies. 1. Theological discourse, where childbearing is religiously encouraged but not obligatory. 2. Legal permissibility. Contraception and family planning is discussed and allowed in certain situations, but complete voluntary childlessness is not explored as much. 3. Social and cultural expectations. In Muslim communities, fertility and motherhood make marriage successful, so childless couples and especially women are stigmatized. 4. Gender plays important role. The moral as well as biological burden about childbearing rests asymmetrically on women, so they bear the brunt of childlessness even when the decision to remain child-free might be a mutual decision between husband and wife. And 5. Bioethical and policy implications. That is, how Islamic institutions and authorities like those who declare fatwas view reproductive rights and autonomy. It also examines how voluntary childlessness is viewed in Islamic law, which is called Maqasid al-Sharia. On these dimensions, there are references to local studies in countries like Iran, Tunisia, Pakistan, Senegal, Ghana, Tanzania, Jordan, Nigeria, as well as Muslim minorities in Western countries. The study finds that classical Islamic teachings strongly encourage procreation. Not surprising, they view children as blessings and marriage as oriented towards family formation. However, childbearing is not legally obligatory in marriage. Ethical reasoning in Islam historically allowed flexibility, particularly where harm, hardship, or welfare considerations apply. On legal aspects, contraception has long been permitted under Islamic law in many schools, especially when justified by health, economic, or familial reasons. But permanent voluntary childlessness remains highly contested and generally not endorsed unless medically necessary. There is flexibility for things like birth spacing, but far less consensus on permanently opting out of parenthood. Hifz al-Nasl, that is, preservation of lineage, is an important consideration. Most scholars interpret Hifz al-Nasl as favoring reproduction, yet the literature shows this principle has not always meant maximum reproduction, but rather protection of family welfare, healthy upbringing, social stability, and so on. The paper argues that Hifz al-Nasl could be reinterpreted more broadly rather than as a strict reproductive mandate. However, things are rather gloomy when it comes to gender. Women bear disproportionate stigma for childlessness. Motherhood is often treated as a religious and social duty even when the decision is mutual. Men face far less moral or social scrutiny. Feminist Islamic perspectives remain underdeveloped in this literature despite being highly relevant. But things are improving too. Urbanization, education, economic pressures, environmental concerns, and mental health awareness are reshaping reproductive choices. Only a few Muslims explicitly identify as child-free, but many practice de facto non-parenthood. Religious norms continue to clash with emerging individual autonomy. On bioethical and policy front, Muslim majority states often allow family planning but lack ethical frameworks for voluntary childlessness. Access to permanent contraception is inconsistent and sometimes coercively restrictive. The study identifies some gaps while studying voluntary childlessness in Islam. Most studies are concentrated in Southeast Asia. They tend to overly focus on family planning and contraception and not enough on direct child-free choice. These studies also lack nuances separating various sects within Islam like Shia, Sunni, and subsections within them. One of the biggest gaps is lack of qualitative studies. Most studies are quantitative, meaning they deal with data like how many people use contraception or how many people view something in certain way and so on. But there is a gap to study lived experiences of those who are child-free and have to navigate within the Islamic religious, cultural, and social structures, especially women. And there's also a lack of Islamic feminist studies in this area. Another gap is the lack of studies about Islamic child-free people who live as minorities minorities, for example, Muslims in Western nations, and so on. So, a lot of gaps which form recommendations for the further studies to be conducted in this area. Now, you might have noticed that antinatalism does not even appear in this discussion, but I thought this is a step in that direction. Not having children has to be normalized before we can have people who are open to even listening to antinatalist arguments. The situation in many parts right now is such that people can't even imagine not having children, especially if one is married. And so, looking at these studies gives us a picture of reality while we discuss thought experiments and complex ethical questions. The Korean Times reported a slight increase in fertility rate for 2025 until October of this year. It has risen to 0.81 children per woman. Number of births had also increased in October 2025. This is the 16th consecutive month of increasing number of births since July 2024. Both number of marriages and the number of divorces have increased. But the population decline continued as number of deaths still exceed the total number of births. The decline in Korean population has been going on since 2019. There was one podcast which was broadcast in June this year by BBC and which we missed reporting on. Is having children a moral duty? It was a panel discussion with 4 panelists from various backgrounds and 4 guest speakers along with the anchor. So it was a little difficult to keep track on audio of who was speaking when, but there was some interesting questions about having children. Unfortunately, there was only a cursory reference to antinatalism at around 45-minute mark, and that too was in a disparaging tone, like it is easy to do antinatalism but pronatalism is hard and so virtuous. Even then, it was a good discussion around the topic of having children, environmental effects of having children, ethno-nationalism, the case of Hungary, women's roles and expectations on this topic, the reproductive rights and autonomy, the cost of having and raising children, the opportunity cost of having them, the rural versus urban divide in fertility rates, why some Scandinavian countries are having low fertility despite having very family friendly policies, and so on. Very little was discussed in terms of actual morality of bringing another life into existence, but still an interesting discussion for anyone thinking of having or not having children in general. That was a short update to end this year. I hope 2026 brings some good news for antinatalism, and I wish everyone a very happy new year. Thanks for watching and see you next year.